Hi, everyone. We'll let everyone come on in, but I am Megan Bates. I'm the Senior Community Strategist here at Hivebrite. Today, I have the pleasure of sharing the virtual stage with Liz Kohlway, who is the Director of the Boost Community Engagement and Applied Learning Community at Saban Institute. And I also have Dustin Stiver here, who is the Principal Learning Experience Designer at Mural. So thank you both for being with us today. It's really exciting to have you. To our audience, please be aware that you can ask questions throughout the Q&A using the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer any questions you may have toward the end. We'd also love to read more about your communities, your goals, and your challenges, so please let us know if you have any of those through the chat. So now with all the intros out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. So tell us a little bit about your communities. I'll start with Dustin first, but let us know your community experience.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me, Megan. It's nice to be here. My name is Dustin Stiver. I have a long history in community that started in the social sector and sort of built communities, particularly in the education world here in the United States. Then transitioned and worked in the world of human-centered design, or design thinking, as it's sometimes called. And so worked on community building there. And then most recently in the tech sector. So I work for a company called Mural, and Mural is a virtual collaboration software, but we're working to unlock the power of teamwork around the world. And so we're thinking about ways to do that through communities of product, as they're sometimes called, which are, communities that are really focused on like how product works, how software works, how it can be changed, how it can be improved. But I'm most interested in communities of practice, which is where people sort of hone their skills and sort of learn how to do things better together. And so that's sort of two ways I think about it, like product versus practice. And I'm sort of thinking about both of those now. And then the last thing I'll say is I did my dissertation research years ago, focusing on community leaders and trying to understand how they do their work, how they do it well, and how we can help people do it better. So that's a little bit about me. Thanks, Megan.
That's awesome, Dustin. Thanks for joining us today. Liz, share a little bit about you. Tell us about your experience in community.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the community building space for probably the last 10 years or so, and specifically within the field of global health. And currently I work for the Saban Vaccine Institute, which is an organization committed to making vaccines more accessible, enabling innovation, and also encouraging uptake of vaccines. Sorry, hold on one second. And so on the slide, I just have some metrics or demographics about our community. So Boost is a program of the Saban Vaccine Institute. It's a global community of immunization professionals from now over 155 countries. And when I'm talking about immunization professionals, I'm referring to individuals who are responsible for managing routine and life course immunization programs within their countries. So either at a national or country level, or also at a subnational level. So working, for instance, in a health district or facility. So launched in early 2020, we support this dynamic and growing community by sharing relevant news and events and offering a variety of leadership and advocacy virtual trainings alongside and often integrated into more technical immunization content. And obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, this community in particular has had to face a number of challenges, including the rise of vaccine misinformation and hesitancy. So hence there's been really a need to further support and strengthen this community and kind of come together to learn from some of those shared experiences. Back over to you, Megan.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Liz. I just want to say to everyone who's out in the audience, we have such a really cool panelist group here today. So I hope you learn tons of things from both Liz and Dustin. But I also just wanted to mention for Liz and Dustin, we're joined, if you can see in the chat, there's so many people around the globe who are joining us today. So we have a variety of roles. We've got community managers, marketing managers, founders, all kinds of folks in the chat. So thank you guys for chiming in. I'm seeing someone from the Philippines even joining right now. So I'm just really excited to have you guys here today. So thank you. All right, let's continue on. So tell me, Dustin, Liz, what does effective facilitation look like in an online community space?
Sure, I can go ahead and go first. So for Boost, effective facilitation kind of looks different depending on which segment of our community you're looking at. In fact, we developed, and just to share, a model that illustrates both our member engagement and learning. I know that the topic of this webinar is obviously focused on community engagement, but we really see this as interwoven with our members' learning journey. So I might be speaking to both here. And so our larger community is really the first touch point for members who can interact with our large and diverse membership. And here our Boost team of community moderators is largely facilitating engagement through a curated monthly newsletter, publishing news posts, and hosting periodic events. And all of our members are really encouraged to post their own news and events to share with the community. And in fact, we have a section of our newsletter which highlights different parts of our community platform to really enable that engagement. We've also set up groups around specific interest areas in immunization, such as the focus on gender immunization or COVID-19 vaccination. And this allows group members to address a particular topic in greater detail, and for our group moderators to post kind of these targeted forum questions which inspire rich discussions amongst our members. And then the next level of our community is our community of practice, or we actually like to refer to this as engaged communities, because I will say we found that community of practice can be a bit of a used and abused term in our space, and we want to make sure people really know kind of what we're talking about when we're referring to communities of practice. And this really involves our members working together to reach a common goal, and for example, working on a capstone project for a training. And at this level, our members begin to really take the lead with support from training facilitators and collaboration with peers. And then finally, this last level is our local solution action learning. And this is for members that are looking to test innovative solutions to address immunization challenges within their communities. And at this level, members are fully activated with additional support by dedicated mentors, peers, and then in some instances, we provide some microfunding to help get those projects off the ground. And then this next slide just demonstrates the various learning and engagement offerings throughout these different facets of our Boost community. And I would say at the beginning of this pathway, the facilitation is heavily managed by the Boost team, while maybe Boost members are a little bit more passive. However, as Boost members kind of move into engaged communities and the local action learning, they become much more active and involved in trainings, peer-to-peer learning, and eventually actually translating some of those learnings into action. And we've actually identified this inflection point where we found engagement and learning to be highly impactful, as demonstrated from both our community and training evaluations. And I think we're going to get to metrics in a bit, so I'll kind of leave it there, but just to showcase kind of how we've thought about and synthesized some of the learnings that we've had with, from our community.
Liz, what I really love about what you just shared is that community can be so directional. And if you give folks a sense of direction, and here's, the circles that you've created for like engagement, I think it really allows people to understand what their trajectory could be in the community. And it also helps you to create some level of tracking of where users are and the success of what each level has been. So really commend that. That's awesome. Dustin, what about you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in too. I think sort of at a bit of a higher level, some of the research I've done has looked exactly at like successful community leaders and some of the things they do to help make the kind of examples that you just saw happen. And I think there's a couple things to touch on. So the first one is, I always say lead as one among many, right? That might seem obvious, but I think community leaders embrace that more than some other leaders you might have experienced. And I think there's something about that idea of lateral leadership that makes you a better facilitator when you're working in online communities or working in the community building space. So I think that's sort of the primary thing on my mind when I think about effective facilitation, is like how you position yourself within relation to the other people that you're working with and working on behalf of, right? So that sort of lateral leadership principle is like pretty top of mind for me. I also think there's a lot about emotional competence or relational competence, as I sometimes call it, which, you know, can be broken down just as like the ability to like read people and like understand where they're coming from and try to walk in their shoes a little bit more. That means a lot, I think, when you're trying to effectively lead a community. Like you often need to have some shared experience there, and that will help you do a better job of being a community leader. There's a third idea around what I call agile discernment. So communities are not static. Like they're always changing, they're always evolving, and you're always making little decisions and sometimes big decisions about the future of them. And so you have to be agile in your thinking and how you're sort of understanding what's going on and where you want to go next. I think creating like a 12-month content plan and a bunch of good prompts for your community is fine, but like you also need to be agile and sort of adapt along the way. And then the final two I just touch on. One is sort of about the idea of like social action, or how can you accelerate social processes, like things that might exist anyway. Like I might want to reach out and have a conversation with Meghan about something, but like what can a community leader do to help make sure that that's easy and that that's not difficult and there's not too much friction. So there's things you can do to like set that up. And then overall, I think it's a craft. Like I think community leadership, I think facilitation in this world, I think it's a craft, and like any other craft, it's something that can be like learned and perfected over time, and you can hone those skills through reflective practice and learning from others and failing forward and all those things you might have heard. Um, but I do think it's a craft that can be developed over time. So a few ideas.
Dustin, I think you're getting some praise here in the chat. Timmy just said, you know, being agile really resonates with them. Could you share a little bit more, dig into how you find the balance between guiding a discussion, but also maintaining kind of organic interaction in a community?
Yeah, I think that's a real balance, right? I think that again, you'll hear me quote these phrases, but like create the conditions for collaboration. I think that's what we're about. It's about stewarding a conversation, and it's about being like really aware of what's happening with your specific community. And I think what's happening at maybe a slightly higher level too, to be able to make those good decisions about like, oh, well, this week I was gonna do a prompt about this topic, but actually that doesn't make any sense. Like something important has happened in the world. The context within my community has changed. Somebody else has lit a fire around some other kind of conversation. Like, let's go where that energy is. Like, let's follow that and not be so rigid, maybe, about a content plan that we had already made. And I think that's part of it, is just sort of being connected to your community, being open to that kind of feedback, and sort of recognizing like where the patterns are so that you can follow them.
Liz, anything you want to share there just from Saban? Like, how do you guys kind of straddle the fence between guiding a discussion, but also making it organic and natural?
Yeah, I think that's always a bit of a challenge for sure. I think at the beginning, when we launched our community, we relied on some of our early adopters, which we kind of call our Boost community champions. And these are folks that have been not only involved in our events and trainings, but have really been actively contributing to and leading discussions on our community platform, and often without kind of prompting from our moderators. And I think in the community space, the select group is probably representative of maybe like the 1% to 2% of our community. So I think there's always that question of, you know, how do you activate others? And I think this is maybe just to give a very specific example from Boost, how kind of some of our unique trainings have come into play. And so we've actually been partnering with an organization called People Power Health since 2020 to offer membership trainings on community organizing, or what we like to say community activation. And this is really with the lens of immunization. So, you know, the objective of these trainings is to better equip participants with skills and mindset needed to activate members in their own communities to, for instance, bring their children into immunization, or to activate colleagues or supervisors to maybe adopt some new strategies to reach under-vaccinated children. And so part of community organizing or activation is these 5 key leadership principles or practices, which are public narrative, relationship building, structure, strategy, and action. And with all, there's an emphasis on a culture of coaching to really develop each of these practices. And I think what's been beneficial to our larger community is that participants from this program are actually tasked with activating Boost members as part of their capstone project. So they have to recruit members to join a webinar, where they actually lead a training on one of these practices that I described. And those graduates have, of this training have joined this cadre, which I mentioned, of Boost Community Champions, and have gone on actually and now are really active in being or lead facilitators for other trainings. So yeah, what kind of began as activation for individuals community, really bringing in those practices to activate kind of the larger community that we have. That's been like pretty effective for us.
Liz, what I really appreciate and what you're mentioning is, community champions are not something that is just created for like a large subset of the community, or like it's not just an active user. Like you're really empowering a champion to do quality work. And you just mentioned, that's a small percentage of the community. And sometimes people may ask us, well, sometimes things feel a little dormant, and I'm like, well, you've got champions here who are really doing quality work, and that may not always be in the 30% range or the 50 percentile range of your community. So thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about some challenges. So what are some common challenges you guys find when you're engaging community members, and how are some ways you might go about handling that?
Sure, I can start. So I think for the Boost community, I would say our largest challenge is that members are just very busy. So they're busy with their job, maybe they're traveling, to a field site, and they're kind of out of pocket, or they're just busy with their personal lives. And in fact, we've actually had particular challenges in engaging our women members, many of whom have shared with us that they have additional family obligations. So attending, for instance, live events or trainings or engaging on the platform can be difficult. And some of the things that we've done to troubleshoot these challenges are, offering self-paced courses, recording all of our events and making those materials available, so that, they can be viewed at any time that's convenient for our members. And then I think another challenge that we face that I actually think is a good challenge is, obviously with the diversity of our members comes kind of a range of lived experiences and mindsets that are often molded by one's kind of unique context. So I think in our, for the Boost community, I think vaccine hesitancy is a good example of an issue that can be quite different depending on each community. And again, here, I think our community activation, and we also have adaptive leadership trainings come into play, and really helps our members to build relationships across different stakeholders. So whether you're engaging with a community leader, maybe a mother who's bringing their child in for vaccination, or just engaging with peers on the community platform. And then I think lastly, we also encourage a culture of respect and openness as outlined in our community guidelines. And that kind of sets the precedent for how members should really interact with each other. And we really haven't had a ton of issues in the last few years. So I think folks are really adhering to that, and really looking for a space to engage and work with one another. Again, to kind of come up with solutions to a lot of the pressing challenges that we have in the space.
Dustin, what about you? What does that look like for you?
I think there's sort of a core engagement process that generally applies to most communities, where community leaders try to first bring people together. Like oftentimes that's what we're doing, is creating a place or a space for people to connect. But that's often not enough. Like many of the things that Liz was talking about is like, it's not really an if you build it, they will come situation most of the time. And so I think the first step is, though, to create a space where you can bring people together. But then you have to broker connections between folks. Like you have to give people the opportunity to begin to understand how these relationships are valuable from both sides. And there's mutual benefit coming from that and being a part of this community. Because people are so strapped for time, as the biggest challenge we often hear, there has to be obvious value, very obvious value of being a part of this thing. And so once you sort of broker some of those connections, then the next step is building relationships. I'm much more likely to continue to interact and participate if I know Meghan a little bit better. And it doesn't have to be a lot. You don't need to know everybody's life story, but you need to know them a little bit better. And I think that cycle of bringing folks together, brokering smart connections between people, and then ultimately building relationships within a community is what keeps people coming back. And I will feel more compelled to give up my time and to get provide feedback on something or respond to a challenge if I have a closer relationship with this group of people and the thing that we're after. So that to me is sort of central to the engagement question.
Yeah, I mean, you can't just build a community, like you mentioned, you can't just build it and then people just show up. Like there has to be some really clear understanding of how and what they're there for, what benefit they're going to get. So thanks for that.
And like just good expectations about what good engagement looks like. Like
Yeah.
90% of people are never going to be engaged in your community. Like probably not, right? I mean, it's sort of the old principle of like 1-9-90. Like 1% of people or one person is creating the content. Maybe 9% of people are going to like really like activate around it, but everybody else is lurking, and that's most of the people, and that's okay. Like that's all right. Like I don't think we should have unrealistic expectations about what engagement looks like for a lot of these communities. So
Yeah, the 1-9-90 is so helpful. Definitely awesome. Let's talk about measurement of success. So, how do you measure the success of your communities? I know tons of communities come to me and say, we've got 100,000 members and we're expecting, like you said, we're expecting majority of them to participate, and maybe sometimes they don't. So, how do you measure the success of your communities? I'll start with Dustin and then we'll go to Liz.
So I'm going to borrow from some work by a person named David Spinks, who wrote a really good book called The Business of Belonging, which came out in the last couple of years. I would recommend it if you haven't seen it. But in that book, he sort of sets up a framework where you think about community at 3 levels. So there's the organizational level, or sometimes called the business level, but the organization level. And then there's a community level and a tactical level. And there are things you're trying to achieve at all 3 of those levels, which should inform the metrics that you're going after. So, at the organizational level, you're potentially trying to like grow engagement or grow revenue or grow investment or achieve social goals. Like those are the highest level things you're after at that level, and that should inform your metrics. At the community level, what you're thinking about there is like how to actually create a healthy and engaged community. So that could be number of members, might be the most obvious version of like a metric there, but it could be subscribers to a newsletter or something else that you're doing. And then there's these like really tactical things that you're doing and you're trying. So maybe you have some kind of campaign that you're running. And so like, what are the social metrics associated with that campaign? Like that's at the more like minuscule kind of tiny level. And I think you're sort of thinking about all those things, or it's helpful to think about all those things as being different from each other, and then trying to pick metrics that make sense for you and your community, and then track those over time to see where the changes are happening. So that's the way I've started to think about it, is kind of at those 3 levels, and that's been helpful to me.
Very cool. Liz, what about you?
Yeah, I think kind of like just to reiterate what Dustin said, I mean, you really do have to, choose metrics that are going to be most meaningful to your community, and that can really vary. So again, I mean, just an example from our community, we're really connecting both engagement with learning. And, we've really appreciated the level and breadth of the analytics that the Hivebrite community platform has offered. And we've actually gone further to pair some of those metrics with a few other systems that we use for engagement and learning, such as Zoom for virtual events, and we have a learning management system that we use for some of our like self-paced content. And on this slide, you can see a few snapshots from actually our Airtable interface. And so we built out an integration with support from the Hivebrite team to be able to actually sync our community platform, our event and training data all together with our Airtable account for kind of an overall view of member engagement, which is actually now updated daily, which is awesome. And we've created this kind of new adapted engagement score, which takes into account both kind of our member engagement and learning. That's been really effective to kind of figure out what things are working, where we can improve, et cetera. And we also utilize kind of a member sign up form to collect some of the more detailed demographic and background information on our members. And this allows us to kind of break down engagement by, particular world region or maybe level of the immunization system. I think this is important, to enable us to monitor engagement of our kind of core target audience. So really understanding, where we want our most, our core audience to be engaged with us. So again, yeah, I know there are a lot of numbers, but this is just something that we've kind of used to make sense of, how we can make adjustments and improve engagement with our community.
Very, very cool. Thanks for sharing that, Liz. It's lots of really cool analytics. Final question here, but before I ask that, I know we've had tons of kind of good feedback in the chat. I want to encourage everyone on the call. If you have questions, please do drop them in the chat, and we'll definitely, we've got one more question, but I'd love to get some of the questions from the audience asked to Liz and Dustin as well. So one of my final questions for you guys is, what role do you think community design plays in engagement?
I can jump in. So community design, meaning like the design of your community, the decisions you're making to set up your community for success. That's how I interpret that.
Yes.
And the main thing on my mind there is the importance of co-design. Like, you should rarely be designing the community without the other people that you're trying to serve. So design with versus design for is a way that that's phrased sometimes. And there's practical things you can do to help with that. Like, some of that is, of course, like borrowing from other successful models and looking for inspiration. But I come from the world of like I said, of design and human-centered design. And so I'm always thinking of like really tactical activities and methods that can help here. And there's a whole world. It's sometimes called participatory research, which is just fancy language for like talking to other people so that you can build something together. And there's a bunch of methods there that are really, really helpful. I mean, there's stuff like asking your community like what's on their mind. Like, there's a method called what's on your radar. It is very simple, but it's a way to collect like great feedback very simply from people to try to understand like where they are and where they think the community should go. There's obviously easy ways to collect feedback through platforms like Hivebrite and others, but you have to get into the cycle of like asking those questions. Like, for me, it's about leading with questions. Like, if you're not asking questions, then maybe you could be doing it better. And I think if you think about some of these co-design or participatory design activities, like, that's a great way to be engaged with your community around questions that you may not know the answer to. And the nice thing about facilitating these communities is, like, I don't think people are actually looking to you or to me to have all the answers. I think it's just about sort of creating those conditions where people can have the kind of conversations they need to achieve their goals. So you don't have to feel like you've got all the answers, but if you lead with questions, have these moments of co-design. And again, I think it's moments. Like, I think community life is cyclical. And so I think there's like this, you set up a community and there's this moment where you're sort of shaping it, as I like to say, and you're creating those initial conditions. And that's a phase. But then you try some things and you facilitate some activity and you put some prompts into the world and you run a challenge, and some of that works and some of it doesn't. And you assess it and you look back and you reflect and you do a retro, and then you shape it again, you reshape it. And it's just like spirals up, like, and you just continue to get better and better as you go. And so those are some of the things I think about when it comes to the community design conversation.
Thanks, Dustin. Liz, any feedback on that one or anything you want to add?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely agree that, this community design is iterative, and it starts, and then you have to go back and improve things, and chatting with your community. And I think, for Boost, community design was really essential from the start. So we surveyed and interviewed our immunization professionals to really understand their challenges and what they were looking for in a community of peers and experts in the space. We also tested the platform to get feedback on that, to make sure that it was user-friendly and folks didn't have a barrier to that actual engagement. And since then, we've really relied on an annual membership survey and also soliciting feedback when we host events and trainings, so that we can gather that feedback to incorporate in future and make those improvements to the community. And then on this slide, I just wanted to highlight our Boost Insights group, or our big group, which we launched kind of soon after the platform went live. And this was really an effort to learn directly from our members and how we could best support the community. And this allows us not only to get kind of feedback on community offerings, but an idea of where the immunization landscape is headed, and what members truly need to do and expand their important work. And during these sessions, our team kind of likes to go in that listening mode, so that we can just listen to the insights and experiences of our members. And we also engage this group quite often in the co-design of future trainings, and to make sure, obviously, again, they're impactful for our members. And I think something that we're trying to do in the near future is actually move this group from insights to activation. And we're actually currently developing some roles for our big members to play in leading kind of regional and country groups in the platform. So I think, this is, again, engaging with our members, really having them lead certain elements of the platform, I think is critical to kind of continuing and expand member engagement.
That's beautiful. Liz, I think your community is one of the strongest examples, I think, of how to start members off as just baseline members and raise them up as champions and super users and folks who actually have kind of autonomy in their ability to lead the community as well. So everyone joining, please do ask any questions or just really absorb some of the things that are coming from Liz in that regard. It's really awesome. We've got tons of questions in the chat, Liz and Dustin. So how do you guys think? I'd love to answer a few questions there as well. Would you be open to that?
Yeah,
cool.
Definitely.
All right. Well, I'm going to start with some of the more facilitation specific ones, and then we'll go into some general community ones. But Dustin, we'll start with Dustin here on this one. How do you ensure that passive users are heard in a community, but also fed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's some standard things you can do. Like, I think the ability of sort of always having a way for people to provide feedback, so that it's like a constant option, is something that should be like baseline, especially for passive users. Again, anytime you're talking about passive users, the amount of friction that they experience needs to be as little as possible. So, I mean, think about something like you have to sign in and create a profile to be able to comment. Like, there may be very good reasons to make that decision. Like, there may be also really good reasons to not require people to do that if you're looking to get more passive engagement, or from folks that really aren't going to go through even that step of trying to get involved. So I think you're always thinking about how to reduce the friction, create a consistent opportunity for people to provide that kind of feedback, but also more dedicated and direct moments. So, in the spirit of community building always being iterating, there are opportunities to create very specific windows where people can provide feedback about really specific topics. And sometimes I've seen that work well too. Like the general, hey, let me know how you think the community is going and how we could do better, doesn't yield a lot of great results in my experience. But if you have a really specific thing you want to try or test, and there are passive users in your community that have some expertise around that, then going and asking for their feedback directly and sometimes personally, which isn't always possible. But I think community building is about doing things that don't always scale. Not everything can just be an automated message. And so if there's something that's really important to you, learn about the people who have good ideas about that, and reach out to them directly and try to pull them a step closer. And that will also go back towards the building relationships point that we were talking about earlier. So a couple of ideas there. Liz, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think for some of our more passive members, I think that's where the annual survey is a good opportunity if it's anonymous and people feel maybe that's a little bit more comfortable. But I definitely agree with, if you can get more personal and more targeted, I think the better. And I think if you actually call someone out, maybe not in front of people, but actually, message them, I think people appreciate that attention, and they feel maybe encouraged to provide some feedback. So yeah, definitely agree with that approach.
Yeah, I know from working with Liz directly, or excuse me, with Dustin directly, that you have a lot of good experience with providing retrospectives and giving quality opportunity for users to give feedback. And Liz, I know that's something that's really important to your community as well. So thank you for those. There is a question that's more general in terms of just engagement. So there's someone in the chat who says they manage a community, or actually over 30 communities, wow, for an accounting association. So they appointed community leaders to help with managing it because clearly it's a lot to handle. The issue they're struggling with is engagement and keeping users incentivized to start discussion and share information. So could either of you share any engagement strategies that you feel have been successful for your communities?
Sure, I'm happy to maybe kick things off. So I think, I think something that I often have to even share with some colleagues internally is I think there's an expectation, oh, you've built this beautiful community, and I think Dustin mentioned this, like they will come, but that's like obviously not going to necessarily happen. And I think something further is, around building relationships. I think before people are willing to kind of start a conversation and engage with others, there has to be a level of trust that's built. And that's why I know for at least our community, having some of these more targeted, engaged communities or trainings is really helpful because folks get to know each other week after week. And yeah, not only kind of having talk about work, but kind of bringing in their personal experience. And I think once they've actually built some of those connections, it's a lot easier to kind of start that conversation, or people are more willing to maybe share information if they know that, like, oh, I understand who the person is on the other side. And yeah, especially being in that virtual environment, I think you really have to kind of, it takes a little bit maybe more time to build some of those relationships and trust.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. Dustin, anything you want to share?
Yeah, I think that the scale of this is like an interesting problem. Like if you've got 30 different people that you've recruited to help run these communities. I mean, I think in general, that's a good strategy to try to empower like champions or like sub community leaders. That makes sense. But I can imagine the challenge of trying to keep even like that group of people engaged, more or less the people that they're working with. And so I think part of this just comes down to like simplicity, and making sure that the asks of that group of people, those community leaders, are is not too much, but also giving them freedom to be able to work with their group of people in ways they choose. There's something about community and authenticity that always comes through. Like you can sort of tell when there's like inauthentic things happening. And I think part of that is like just allowing people to be themselves. So if you're going to trust somebody to like help lead one of those accounting communities, like then I'd say like give them some pretty clear, simple guidelines of what the goals are and what you're hoping for, but then like allow them to sort of try some things and experiment and do things as they see fit. And I would not expect that all 30 of them would go the same direction or have the same levels of engagement. And so, I think some of the things Liz talked about is pretty helpful, and some of the engaged things we've talked about earlier. But yeah, I mean, it is not surprising to me that you would have that challenge. But I think authenticity and simplicity are two things that could help push that forward.
There's a cool reference I want to make to a community expert called named Charles Vogel. He has this idea, which kind of segues into one of the questions that someone has asked: how do you incentivize champions? We're Hivebrite because what Charles says is community champions, like over time, like their need for incentives and reward changes because these are people who are looking to invest in the members of that community. They want to give back. And so in a lot of ways, that person asked, how do you reward and incentivize these people? I think it changes. It goes from, we all start out with swag and socks and buttons and stickers, and that's great, right? But over time, those users are looking for a much deeper, more altruistic award in nature. So I really appreciate you guys sharing that. There's one final question. I want to honor everyone's time. So I want to ask, Ruth has asked here in the chat, aside from connecting people within the platform, final question, have you had success throwing virtual networking events? She says, our community spans the country and we're ideating on how to throw events that would be 100% virtual. So do either of you have any experience with that, you'd like to share.
Go ahead, Liz.
I was, we haven't thrown really kind of, I guess, virtual networking events in that sense. Most of our events have been, again, more like targeted trainings. But I know that there are kind of platforms to help facilitate, whether it be kind of like breakout rooms or, panels for that particular event. So yeah, I know that there's definitely things out there that you can kind of utilize for that. But yeah, I don't know if Dustin, maybe you have more experience in that space.
Yeah, I've done a lot of this kind of thing over the last like 5 years, especially, and it can absolutely be done. I think there, as as Liz said, like there are platforms you can lean into that like are more about like fun and games, like that just like have an ability to pull people together from anywhere, log on, jump in and like play some games together. So if you're looking for something like lighthearted like that, I think that could really work. Um, for if you're trying to pull people together and like have topical conversations or topics of like conversations about a specific thing, I and granted I work for a company that supports this, but like I think like having some kind of platform like a digital whiteboard like Mural is really really helpful, and it's different than a forum in that like you can express ideas, like do activities together, like connect, add gifs, add pictures, like do other things, like all in a space where you're sort of shared together like online, and it just brings like a different element to the conversation. And so it's not the same as just like being on a Zoom call with 100 people. There's more interaction, it's more visual, like you can tee up and facilitate all kinds of activities, from like fun basic icebreakers to more substantial conversations. And if you haven't looked into those kinds of tools, like any kind of like digital whiteboard or visual collaboration software, I think that helps a lot when you're trying to like build relationships and work together, um, like as a team or as a community, when people are mostly virtual or largely in different places.
Mural definitely was a big game changer for me as a community manager, creating like virtual coolers for everyone to get together, or, even just icebreakers at the start of chats that we'd have together. So it's really awesome. And Ruth, yeah, thank you so much for asking your question as well. We do actually have a little bit more time, so if you guys would like to drop any questions in the Q&A, we'll share those there. But um, I want to ask one question to you guys. What emerging trends do you see shaping the future of community engagement?
I feel like we have to probably talk about AI since that's kind of the hot topic right now. And I feel like every community is probably talking about that or how we can use tools like ChatGPT. I know for the Buse community, since we are kind of an international audience, although we have a lot of our kind of content in English, we're looking to kind of expand into other language areas. And this is where we've actually been training ChatGPT to kind of not only, well, obviously speak other languages, but actually to be able to be responsive to like immunization terms in particular in French. And that's been really helpful in just making sure that we have a pretty large Francophone audience. And oftentimes some even kind of global guidelines are not always translated. So being able to do the translation, but also make sure that it's, ensuring that it's correct and that it's using kind of this specific terminology in the right way. So that's something we're kind of testing out right now, and it's going pretty well. And we've been super impressed by its ability. And I know that it's just going to continue to get more and more realistic. So I'm excited to kind of see how we can use tools like that in the future.
Yeah, that's a very cool answer, Liz. Obviously, AI is going to find its way into like lots of different versions of community building, and lots of the platforms like we use to do community building, like Hivebrite. That all is going to become very commonplace. The other one I would touch on is the idea of like niche communities. I think I saw a chat about this earlier, but I think smaller communities will become much, much more popular, and it's less about like the large giant forum experience and being part of like a massive community, but more about maybe being part of like a couple of communities that are quite a bit smaller. And I think for me, it goes back to the engagement stuff. I think folks are just getting really weary of like all of the internet really, but especially sort of those big community experiences that we're used to having on the internet. And it's not that they're not valuable, it's not that they'll go away, but I think folks are looking more for sort of smaller niche communities that really meet their needs and that they can be a bigger part of and can do some of the things we talked about, like get to know people a little better and have feel like you're a part of it and adopt the identity associated with that and like have a greater sense of connection to what's going on. So I see that as something that I think will continue, in addition to the rise of AI, which of course will be there. And then this isn't always possible, but maybe the other trend that I think I see as we like more fully come out of the last couple of years is just this continued blending of online and in-person activity. Like there's lots of communities that just exist online and will always exist online. And I think there's something to be said for that. But I think some of the most interesting community work is about trying to blend those two spaces and maybe there's like VR elements of that, but I actually think like just the classic like have an experience online for a period of time, but then like also have an experience in person that really bolsters that and like the energy that you receive from that like really moves the community forward. So I think community meetups are like coming back again, and will probably come back in a pretty big way. So.
Love the meetups. Jillian is asking, which kind of segues into that, Dustin. By providing virtual courses and recordings of webinars on the network, how do you keep up attendance in in-person events? So how would you recommend that?
Yeah, I mean, this one I think really depends on like that balance. I think for a community, like you probably need to provide, if you're doing in person at all, like you should also continue to do the other things. Like I think the default is probably that you're recording your sessions and providing documentation and updating people online and like doing all the good online community management. I think that should be the standard and is sort of expected. I think if you're then going into like the in-person world as well, that's a duplicate of that in a lot of ways. And it can, my phrase here is like only do things together that you can't do apart.
Mm.
Right? Like only do things together that you can't do apart. And there's some things that are really good to do like on a platform like Hivebrite or to do from anywhere. And it's actually better. Like it is better to do it that way. And there's some stuff that we still have a really hard time replicating in the online world. And so when I'm designing those kinds of experiences, when I'm thinking about experience design, that phrase is always in my head. And I'm like, what's really good for the technology that I have in front of me and the way that we can connect online? And what
Yeah.
isn't, right? And if that's better in person, then let's do that in person, or let's find another way to do that.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like it's important to give an incentive of some sort to those who can be in person, but to also make sure both the virtual and the in-person audience have a baseline understanding of like the same things so that it's not creating some elite group or some cluster of people who, get special reward just for being in person. Both subsets of users are really important, but just making sure everyone's on the same page and then providing maybe different levels, at a later date is helpful. So, awesome. Gary asks one final question here. We're in the early stages of building a community and signing the contract with Hivebrite. So awesome. Do you have any tips for getting started with a community or building community from scratch?
But I think this kind of goes back to the community design piece and making sure that you're kind of working with community members or members that you think will be joining your community in advance, to ensure that you're kind of getting that feedback from an early stage so that you're not creating kind of something in a vacuum that you might have to kind of, change completely later. I know for us, we had originally started with a different community platform and we had like a list of like 100 things that we needed to change to be kind of meet that maybe minimum viable product for our community. And that was when we were like, no, this isn't going to work for us. We're going to have to start where we know that, our members are going to be able to come online and that user experience will be good because, oftentimes for a virtual community, that's like the first barrier is just getting people onto the platform. So I think once you kind of made that as easy as possible, you want to obviously have programs or offerings that are, of immediate value to kind of hook folks and kind of keep them coming back and really building and growing that community.
Awesome. Dustin, anything you want to share on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially in the very early days, it's about like following the energy and being aware of where it is and sort of designing for it. And so, yeah, definitely would follow the energy. I also think there's something to be said for like just running lots of little experiments, and like lowercase e experiments, like, but have a hypothesis in your head. Like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, if you do something, what do you think is going to happen? And then try it. And, don't over engineer it, but like get out there and try it and see if what you thought was going to happen actually did. And if it did, great. And if it didn't, that's okay. Like, you learned something and you can try something different next time. Like, I think I've definitely been a part of projects where like we've over engineered the design. And so I would say don't do that. Like, go where the energy is, try a bunch of little experiments, like figure out what your hypotheses are. And if you don't like the word hypotheses, like pick another one. What, like, what do you think is going to happen here? And then if it does, great. And if it doesn't, that's okay too. What did you learn and how can you do it better next time? Like, I think that's the spirit of iteration that should guide like early community building.
Yeah. To that, Gary, I'd also mention or recommend looking at the community life cycle. So Dustin mentioned a little bit earlier, but communities should be cyclical in some ways. And so there are about 4 to 5 stages to what we call the like online community life cycle. And most communities maybe start from a building stage, then they can spiral or not spiral, but they'll grow really big because it's the initial launch. And a lot of community managers may think, oh, that's it. This is what the community is going to look like indefinitely. But then you get to that third stage, and communities often go on that third stage, and there's maybe conflict, or maybe you need to shuffle some of the content or move things around. And that third stage creates either a level of positive spike, or it can be a negative spike. And there's some discouragement I feel I get from community managers at that point. But if you can get out of that stage, eventually all good communities at some point have the potential to grow and split, and that's mitosis. So following some level of a cycle will help you to understand that community isn't just about starting at one point and constantly rising, but knowing at each stage your community has the ability to kind of have some troubleshooting phases and some feedback phases that are necessary for growth. So just wanted to touch on that as well. Awesome. Well, we are getting toward the end of our time together. Dustin, Liz, anything that you guys would like to add before we close today?
I think everything else from my end, other than for those that are kind of in the midst of launching communities. Yeah, it just, encouragement and, it's definitely a learning experience. And definitely, to echo what Dustin said, I think a lot of it is a little bit of experimentation at the beginning, but I think at the end of the day, your community is going to really appreciate kind of the effort that you're putting into it, and trying to tailor and make sure that you're offering things that are, best for your community.
Yeah, and I guess my parting shot would be, this is about facilitation, right? And so the word actually means to make things easier. Like, that's what facilitation's about. And so whether you fancy yourself as a formal facilitator or not, like, just be looking for ways to make things easier.
It's beautiful. Thank you, guys. Thank you all for your questions and your notes in the chat. Even the little AI bots have been taking away some things from the meeting. So thank you guys for joining today. Liz, Dustin, I cannot say, I'm just so very grateful for you guys being here today. And I think that of all the webinars I've done, it's just been so cool to see the chat and see everyone so engaged with you. So thank you. I think that's a reflection of your work as well. To our audience, yes, someone did ask, we will be sharing a recording by email. So if you have any questions, you can reply to us in that email and let us know. And then in addition, Kat has dropped a survey link in the chat. So if you have any feedback, comments, concerns, feel free to share them there. We listen to them and we use them to optimize future webinars. So thank you guys for joining from all over the world. I hope the rest of your week goes well, and thank you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, everyone.